My name is Aaron Levere, and welcome to my podcast. I explore the deep reaches of space and time to talk to the people influencing or influenced by knives. In an effort to unpack the rich and complex culture and history surrounding edge tools and adjacent crafts, I jump off into the abyss to talk about all things knives with special guests all the time. Join me as we reminisce of the good old days on the Good Old Blades podcast. I find that every time I talk to the old guard of knife maker, how fortunate I am to be in a time where knowledge is so accessible. For the pioneers in custom and handmade knives, every ounce of knowledge could be attributed to an egregious amount of want to in order to get anything done. For the OG knife maker that stood the test of time like Jim Sornberger, that want to has been married with an undying passion for knives and art that's managed to weather a lot of storms since the 70s. Probably best known for his California Gold Rush period style, San Francisco dress knives, canes, and native gold and quartz work, Jim has carried a legacy of an aesthetic that could have easily died out had it not been for him and a few like him. Additionally, Jim has been a bastion of supporting the craft through his historic research, documentation, and education for the better part of 50 years. Magazines, books, videos, social media, podcasts, he's adopted whatever medium he can to breathe renewed life into the craft. And that's why I wanted to talk to him so much. We all as knife makers take for granted the information we can get on learning how to make things, but we often forget that context of information matters a lot, and someone like Jim, even for growing older, has a mind like a steel trap for details. Jim, I am really honored to have you on the Good Old Blades podcast.
Thank you. It's been a while to be able to get to you, but I'm here.
Yeah. I think we've probably been planning this for almost a year now, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, a lot's gone on in a year. You know, I got new great-grandbabies, and I travel quite a bit, so. And the shows, and engraving, and working, so.
Yeah. And your travels abroad, I mean, all of your work in Cambodia and everything takes up a bunch of time, too.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is a pleasure. I really wanted to have you on the show because you're just a wealth of knowledge, and you're a phenomenal knife maker, and you're a great person. On top of that, I mean, you're kind of like a Renaissance man, and you know, I foresee, based on what we've been talking about through all of this, that I'll have you on multiple times to try to get through the breadth of some of the knife history that you have stored up in your noggin, and you've been writing about for as long as you have. And I'd love people to be able to hear it from the horse's mouth, especially. But for those who are not familiar with you, and if they're not, shame on them, can you give a kind of like how you got into knives and what it is that your focus is and everything like that? Just kind of like a brief biograph, as it were.
Yeah, probably the thing that led to the knives. I was in law enforcement, and I was injured, and I was off for quite a period of time at one time. And anyway, one of the big gun shows in the country in those days was the San Jose gun show. Bill Wacker had a show there for many years at the fairgrounds. And many of us attended. I'd gotten back from the service, and I've been into guns all my life. My uncle had a gun shop and everything when I was a kid. The fact is, on that point, my uncle had a gun shop, like I said, in Redding, California, right after WW2, and it's still operating today with his son. But I spent a lot of time in the gun shop, and I remember meeting Harry Morseth. He used to stop there. He had a display of knives there. And I thought it was pretty interesting. I was a kid. I was 10 or 11, but I thought it was pretty interesting that somebody actually made their living making knives. So, but anyway, continue on with the conversation. At the Bill Wacker's San Jose Gun Show at the fairgrounds, I had met Dave Pitt. Dave was had an archery shop in Fremont, California, and or Hayward, and he introduced me to Ed Henry. Ed was at the show, and Les Berryman and Ron Richard, and this was 1972, and I was looking for something to do. I'd been making jewelry. I'd been doing a lot of things into lapidary work since I was a kid. But anyway, after meeting them, I decided, wow, this knife making looks interesting. So I hooked up with Les Berryman. He was in Fremont, California at the time, and I used to go over there in the evenings. He worked on the day. But anyway, he showed me some of the basics. And anyway, that's how it started.
When like what did the scene look like in the early 70s as far as knife making equipment and things like that? Was it similar to what you were using in jewelry making or lapidary, or was there what I guess what does the evolution look like from those earlier days?
Um, Les built his grinder, and later I bought it from him, but he built a grinder using an elevator motor, and he has gotten a 12-inch elevator wheel, aluminum elevator wheel, and had it rubber coated in Oakland by a place that did that back in the day. And anyway, that was our original grinder, and I ground uh, many hundreds of knives on that grinder. So the equipment was pretty crude back in those days. Most people tried to figure out something to use. Um, when the Barney Loveless book came out, How to Make Knives, Richard Barney was a good friend of mine. He lived in Mount Shasta, north of Redding, but and he doesn't get enough credit for that book. Richard Barney actually did all the photography and the writing for that book. Bob lent a tremendous amount of time and knowledge to it also, and should have credit for it also. But Richard actually did the hard work on that book and the photography, and traveled around to Bill Moran's, and he spent time with all the knife making shops and lived several months at Bob's. And he was a heck of a knife maker too. But he was very instrumental in the early days of knife making as a black and white photographer and as a writer. The first book of Gun Digest that Bill Cassidy wrote out here in California, Richard did many of the articles and all the photography work. So, and he did a lot. There was a lot of photographs published in different uh, places that Richard did. So he was instrumental in the early days. But anyway, that book got into belt grinders that Bob used, and on down the line, a lot of the equipment. And most of us use that as a guide. That book has still got all of the very basics you need to make a knife. Richard Barney even made a knife in there using files, and did a really nice job making that knife, and it's pictured in the book. So you don't need anything really high tech to get into it. And I made some knives with a file just to see if you could do it. And following his example in the book, it was really easy to do. So
Yeah, I think my first knife, well, first several knives were on files. They didn't look that great, but um, but you know how it goes. And then I graduate like it basically is like the standard progression now is like if you want to get into it to see if you like it, maybe you start with files and maybe make a little filing jig for the bevels, and then maybe progress up to the 1x30 that Harbor Freight sells, or a few of these other like Delta sells one. And then if you're if you're feeling like you still want to progress further, you get like a 2x72 or was a 2x48 or whatever. But I've noticed there is kind of like this fringe society of knife makers that still do like the build your own grinders and whatnot. But by and large, if you factor in time and materials and everything like that, some of these lower cost grinders that are out there that are 2x72 are actually, pretty phenomenal to be able to clip in or buy into a 2x72 and do, the work on those things. So it's interesting because, like Bruce Bump had built his, like, was like a World War II era like tank tire or something like that. And his is like 22 or 27 inches or 30 inches. It's something insane how large the circumference is on his.
Yeah, Frank Sinafana used cam grinding wheels, stone wheels, wet, and that's how he made his knives forever. So there's a lot of equipment that can be used. Some of the lapidary equipment actually works for it. The stone grinders, obviously buffers are fairly common in jewelry, knives, all kinds of things. So, but I know Harbor Freight. I saw a grinder in there not long ago, and they're advertising 2x72, and I think it was $600 or $700, which I don't think you could really build one. Uh, it would be close. Okay, if your time is free, you could do it, but otherwise, that's a pretty good bargain for a grinder to start with.
Oh yeah, yeah. The Grizzly style buffer, or so it's like a buffer and grinder combination. So it has a shaft for a buffing wheel, and then the other side drives the drive wheel for the 2x72. They have one that's a fairly long horizontal, and I think it's under $700. But I've seen a lot of knife makers, well, that originally bought that as an investment and still use it today. So, I mean, it's interesting, at least to me, to look back at somewhat of the humble beginnings in knife making and the difference in equipment.
Well, yeah, in the early days, in fact, is before that Barney Loveless book came out, David Boy had written a book on making knives, blacksmith approach. There was a couple of books around, but on the equipment, nobody really knew. So it was kind of an experimental thing. Um, Loveless had an advantage. He was in the Southern California area, and there were centerless grinding shops and everything going on. So, and a lot of equipment manufacturers, Burr King and others down there that made a lot of high tech equipment. I say high tech; it worked really well for knife making, but most of us didn't know it existed at the time until that book came out. And that's still a good Bible for anybody in a knife shop is get the Barney Loveless book. It's common sense. Most of the stuff is still good basic knife making information, and you can still make knives following the directions in that book and see some of the equipment that's used. It may be a little bit outdated as far as some of the metals for making knives, etc., and some of the equipment, but basically, it's still a good, solid library book. Every knife maker should have it.
Yeah, and that's the how to make knives, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Well, one thing that there are two sides of kind of like my knife making journey. One was making fixed blade, and the other was wanting to get into pocket knives. And so I had the how to make knives by Barney Loveless, and then I had the how to make folding knives, which had Ron Lake, Frank Santafonte, and Wayne Clay. And a few things that I really appreciate about the transfer of knowledge was that, when you're grinding or when you're using buffing compound, the use of, PPE or like masks and things like that to keep all that out of your lungs, which I haven't seen in a lot of other literature, is the safety component of, the respiratory system and whatnot. So I mean, those are some of the first things that I tried to espouse, was making sure that safety in the knife shop was a primary focus, so that way downstream I didn't have anything like silicosis or those standard lung diseases that you get from grinding a bunch of steel and breathing it in.
Yeah, I think probably the buffing compounds and stuff like that, the polishing and all that are probably even more dangerous than the grinding. I mean, metal's fairly heavy, it falls. Uh, but a lot of the dust from grinding handle materials and or buffing compounds and the wheels that you use for buffing, that stuff floats around everywhere in the shop. And, you know, I think if you have some sort of an exhaust system, it doesn't have to be really elaborate. A stand-up fan and an open window or an open door uh, near the grinding and the polishing and wearing a mask. You really need to wear a mask, and you can tell you wear a mask very long, and there's lines on your face from where the mask fits that show all the crap that's floating around in a knife shop, and it's not good for you.
Yeah. Well, I spent a little while as a jeweler's apprentice, and one of the first things that they had me do was all the buffing. And um, in jewelry, at least, you're working with some pretty volatile things like the vapor from flux and buffing compound and different things like that. And we never used masks, like, ever. It was actually kind of surprising to me that to go from, in jewelry, where that stuff is done, repetitively, to knife making, where buffing is just a component of it, but there's such a focus on the health ramifications of it. um but yeah, I it's a, you can't replace your lungs very easily. So I think that it's a point to note that even today, good ventilation and proper protection for your face and eyes and lungs is almost goes without saying.
Absolutely. Bob and I had a conversation. Bob Lovelace and I had a conversation about that. His lungs were pretty messed up, but contributing factors. He smoked, and he also didn't wear a mask a lot in the early days. So, but I think that most of the knife making in those early days was a learning process, and you didn't know what. Like I said, there wasn't a lot written on that. Um, just a buffing machine alone, so you got enough danger with all that stuff flying around or coming out of it flying around, uh, or getting caught up in a buffer. If you had experience with jewelry and you ever tried to buff a bracelet or something, I'm sure you got your hands spanked pretty hard.
Oh yeah, yeah. I had one wrap around the drive shaft, and luckily it was, I think, if I remember correctly, it was the owner. He had me buffing his Cuban chain. It was like, a bracelet, and it got caught up in there, and he's like, "Yeah, it's okay." And so I think there was like a dent in it, and I had to sand it out and redo everything all over again. He was cool about it, but I'm glad it happened on something where I had a little bit of forgiveness than a customer's piece. I didn't want to, like.
Every machine, yeah, every machine in the shop that goes around or, it's got a motor driven wheel or drill bit or whatever it is, everything in there is dangerous, and you got to use your head all the time. You really do. A lot of people try to hand hold things when they're drilling a larger size hole in a metal blade or in a handle, in handles or whatever, and those things get caught on a drill bit or um, a carbide reamer, whatever you happen to be using in there, and it can spin that around and it will cut you badly. Uh, Things get away in the buffing machines, things get away on the grinders. So you always got to use some safety features. Getting back to what got me interested and into knife making and all that. I think growing up in the area I did, it was Northern California, pretty rural. And after World War II, nobody had any money, so everybody was pretty poor anyway, but dependent on uh, meat as a food source. We hunted, we fished, uh, and all that was pretty common with most families. If dad was a contractor in those days. If he got a good job or something, we might get hamburger from the store, which was kind of a big treat. Um, but otherwise, it was we hunted deer, we hunted bear, squirrel, rabbit, whatever it took to keep some food on the table, and a lot of fishing. Uh, but you always used a knife. I mean, when I was a little kid, and when I say little kid, I mean 7, 8, 9. I was already using knives and stuff to clean fish and waterfowl, ducks, geese, all that sort of stuff. So the introduction to the usefulness of a knife was pretty common knowledge with young people back in those days, as was firearms and stuff. So, they even had classes in school, if you can imagine, for elementary school on teaching gun safety and stuff. So,
Yeah.
but it teaches you a lesson that a knife is a tool. Yeah, it does a particular job, and there's different designs of blades and shapes and stuff. They've been using them for ranching and farming and like I said, hunting and fishing for forever. So I always used them. One of my grandfathers on my mom's side, AJ, he brought me back a knife from Rudy Ruana. He'd hunted up in Idaho and Wyoming and stuff early on, and I think I think just started Boy Scouts. I think so, probably 12 years old, something like that. I still got the Ruana, so it's been around and through the horn. My uncle gave me a Morseth during the Vietnam days. So anyway, I've been around knives pretty much all my life and recognize them as usable. Being able to make them was pretty cool. So
Yeah. Well, and two names that you mentioned with Ruana and Morseth. I mean, we're talking, early American knife makers in this era of post turn of the century, right? And it's interesting that I'd say more so Ruana than Morseth has kind of made a sort of collector's resurgence, and I'm not sure if it's because of the style. Um, um, and the fact that it's still going today. But Morseth knives, especially, I got familiar with because how I was mentioning that how to make lockbacks. One of the models that Wayne Clay made in there actually uses a coil spring for the locking mechanism, for the spring mechanism, and that's something that, as far as I know, first appeared with Morseth, and it was actually something that was in A.G. Russell's catalog when they were working together for quite a while before I guess people don't really like coil springs anymore for the folding spring mechanisms. But I thought that it was interesting because when I was looking at some of the physics and wearability of coil springs versus tension springs with spring steel, it looks like the coil spring actually outlasts most spring mechanisms that you'd find in lockbacks today. And so, it's interesting to me when you look at some of the pedagogy of knives, how much we really owe to you early pioneers and to Ruana and Morseth and all these early knife makers, which you were able to make along with and rub elbows with.
Um, like I said, it was experimental, and I'm sure for them also. You look at Skagel's knives and stuff, uh, or of course Morseth's. Morseth was very interested in steels. What would hold an edge and how well and stuff. And he settled on coil rolls of steel. I think Brusaletto. It's been so long, I don't remember all the. But he was very interested in laminated steels and on down the line. And most of his knives, the late ones, were all laminated steel. They held a heck of an edge. They also rusted really easy, or because it was mild steel on the outside of them.
Yeah.
Rudy Ruenas, they were made from Studebaker springs, and he just about went out of business when Studebaker did. I think Bill Holt at Pacific Heat Treating kind of guided them on spring steels, and so they continued on afterwards. But he liked Studebaker. He said they made the best knives, and they get some interesting ideas.
Yeah, well, it's the mother of invention. Invention is necessity, right? I mean, what's interesting, I think, too, is how we see that a lot of service members that were using kind of what they had in the theater knives and everything at the time brought that home and started to make knives post World War II, and found a lot of scraps and things that I mean, but that was like a convention of the time, right? Is to recycle things and to find ways to use materials and equipment and things that might have been used for other purposes, but in the vein of knives and crafts, right?
Yeah, and to see what actually worked. There was a lot of military, a lot of the guys in the military, and they made service-connected knives, mostly out of boredom, probably. They were stuck on an island somewhere or uh, on the continent in Germany or in Korea or whatever, and they had uh, time to do some things, and whatever the military used was their source of metal. So it might have been a car spring, or it might have been a bolo knife that or machete that the military had. And, they had many of the places had a little machine shop with a grinding wheel, etc. And when I say grinding wheel, I mean hard carbide wheels. That's what everybody used back in those days. Uh, but anyway, they'd end up making a knife out of that and laminated plastic handles and leather and whatever else that they found in the area. I did a story on Bo Randall. I think it was in the December issue last year of Knife Magazine, and I met him up at his family home on Lake Walloon in Michigan, and that's where his entire story started. Um, he'd met a guy scraping the bottom of a boat with a Skagel knife, and anyway, he really, really, really liked the knife, and got involved and talked scale and everything, and went back to Florida. And uh, the family home was up on Lake Walloon, but of course the orange groves were the big money crop for the Randall family, and the knife shop was kind of a hobby thing initially, and then W2 intervened, and they started making knives for uh, this GI and that GI, and pretty soon it was hundreds of knives and more people working in the Randall factory making knives. And he used O1 or O2 uh, steel mostly,
Yeah.
semi-forged and ground.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's also a jumping off point for Bob Lovelace too, right? I mean, he was seeing that Randall knives were being carried in the service and started forging knives and things like that, and he became a competitor to Bo Randall in the Abercrombie and Fitch catalog, as I remember it.
Uh, yeah, it would. Bob's stuff early on was pretty crude. Okay, uh, you know, and I don't mean it in a bad way. Bob was a good guy. We were friends for many years. Uh, but he was trying to figure out how to solder and stuff like that. And that was a challenge for him. So some of the early pieces had holes drilled in the guard to touch the blade, and it was poured lead or whatever in to try and make a solder joint. So Skagel knives and Bo Randall and stuff. I mean, they had to handle on the Abercrombie and Fitch for many years. Uh, but again, okay, Bob did compete, and when Bob came out to California, and his I met him in hmm, God, I think Hawthorne, California, or something. There was a sporting goods shop there that I met him the first time, and he had some knives there. And I couldn't believe his knives were like $110 or something at the time, and most of us were making $50 to $75 knives in those days.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to me. I think from a knife history perspective, because you see this like um, you see people emerge inside of an industry that are really good salesmen, right? That they interpret the value of their work, and then that's kind of sets the stage for the rest of us to play a little bit more with higher prices and whatnot. And it's definitely not anything to disparage Lovelace's memory or anything or his work, but what I see from examples in early work versus when people like Steve Johnson and Jimmy Merritt and them were working in there, that there's a difference between the original works of Bob Lovelace, and then when he expanded his shop and he had other protege knife makers and other established knife makers that really kind of applied their craft to his design principles and things. And then what we know or see today as the examples of Lovelace are really those where he was collaborating with other people in his shop that did the finish work and whatnot.
Well, Steve Johnson, Steve Johnson had a lot of experience by the time he went to work for Bob Lovelace, and he was still a kid. He was still a young man when he went to work for Bob. I think 19 or 20. But he'd worked for Gil Hibben in Hibben's shop, and I think from the Boy Scout days on. He worked there, and he helped Rod Chappelle set up a shop in Washington, and worked with him. So by the time he came to Lovelace's shop, he was a pretty great knife maker already, pretty well established knife maker, I should say already. And contributed greatly, I think, to Bob's success. Now, when you said sales, Bob could sell snow to Eskimos. Okay, Bob was a great salesman. I'll give him that, no matter what. You know, he was a great salesman, um, and pretty much a great founder of the modern knife movement. Actually, we talk about Randall, on down the line, but as far as handmade knife makers and um, their contribution and their research in steel. Ed Henry was big into researching steel back in those days too. Um, and they often argued about, this steel being better than that. It's the same thing that goes on today. This steel's better than that steel. But, you know, uh, 154 CM, ATS 34, and RWL 34, which is Robert W. Lovelace 34, is still ATS 34 and still being manufactured and used today. You know, I remember we had a lot of trouble with 154 CM when it first was being made by um, Crucible Steel. Uh, the American steel standards were pretty rough in the early days, and if there was inclusions and pits and stuff smaller than pea gravel and a piece of steel, it was acceptable. And there were a lot of inclusions. And, when they quit doing a vacuum remelt is when ATS 34 came on the scene from Hitachi Steel in Japan because they had the vacuum remelt process. But our steel companies were turn of the century, and at that time, everything was 1900 technology. Yeah, slowly that's evolved, and now we got some great steel companies, small, in the U.S. So Bob was a great contributor to that, and Bob was a great organizer. I mean, he obviously helped form the Knife Makers Guild with A.G. Russell. The book that came out, with Richard Barney and him collaborating, uh, did a lot for knife making, a tremendous amount for knife making. Uh, the forming of the guild was a great deal back in the early days, and could be again. It went through some growth problems and politics, but I'm not going to get into that right now.
Well, yeah, I mean, we can kind of talk a little bit about the guild a little bit later on. I'm interested to know, like, it's apparent every time that I talk to you that you have a lot of reverence and knowledge for the history of knife making. And, obviously, this being your episode and talking about you, I do want to focus more on your own knife making and the it really is like an inspiration that I don't know that enough people really truly give credit for. But so when you were early on, you were making knives and things like that. How did your time in the service, if you want to talk a little bit about that, how did that uh, I guess influence any of your knife making?
I think I got to go back farther than that. My grandfather got me into lapidary work when I was a kid. The families, both sides, came to California during the gold rush. Both grandfathers were one of them pretty good blacksmith. The other one a fair uh, blacksmith. But back in those days, again, this is after World War II. Most places, most cities didn't have a machine shop, so they had a blacksmith, and you took your whatever kind of work you wanted to have done, you took to the local blacksmith shop, and they were capable of boring or drilling a hole for you or fixing or welding something back together that you broke. Uh, and they were very instrumental in the mining history of California and stuff. And I was always into that. So, uh, but cutting the stones and doing all that, I got into some jewelry making, so you could do something with the stones you cut. And, um, I was always into carving and um, some artistic bent, I guess, all the way back to being a little kid. I think I got a 410 shotgun from my great grandfather, passed down, through the family and stuff. But the old single shot 410, I used to shoot quail and stuff with it. I was pretty good, but and again, it was a food source after the war. But I carved a bear in oak leaves in the stock. I still have it. So it's it's old Harrington Richardson single shot 410. So, you know, but you know what? It still shoots good. I still got the 22 rifle my dad made for my brother and I. He cut down the stock, and it was a Marlin model 1895 lever action. And I got black and white pictures of both my brother and I shooting at. I think I was 8 or 9, and my brother was 10 or 11. So at the time, so pretty pretty neat stuff from those days. But like I said, we were using knives all the time in those days. Okay, and like I said, my uncle had the gun shop, and he carried the factory knives in case, early stuff, and he had a Morissette display and a Randall display, and so I probably the seed of all that was in my brain forever, And like I said, I had a Morissette that I took overseas with me. It rotted really fast. I had to have it. The copper liner was still there, so I had to have a web belt sewed into a sheath for it for the copper liner for the Morissette. But it worked good. It was a good knife. It rusted really easy over there. The humidity was a heck of a problem. That was probably planted the seed that stainless material later on would be much better to make a knife out of than something that rusted really easy.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
And when you were carrying that, were you in Vietnam? Is that correct?
I was in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos quite a bit, and Thailand. We are one of the bases we operated at. I was in Thailand, so.
Yeah. And what branch of the service were you in, and kind of what did you do when you were?
I was in the Army, and I was an advisor over there. This is early, way back time. Okay, 63. Came back in 66, so it was a long time ago. Early part of the war. Actually, I think Vietnam started basically 65. Yeah, I mean it started long before then, but we got involved heavily in from early 65. But we were training troops over there or uh, trying to recover our aircraft that went down and stuff. But a long time ago, in places we weren't, you know.
Yeah, no, I get it. Well, so how long had you been getting into lapidary and things like that before you started your first knife? Did your knife making experience start after you came back from the war, or was that something that you did while you were kind of like in conjunction with your jewelry stuff?
Uh, Actually, I made a tomahawk. I think was the first piece that I made, combined with the jewelry stuff that I was doing. Um, but I got into lapidary work that was my grandpa got me in that. I was like 6 or 7 years old. Uh, he was always a rock nut, and at the time we were using what they call mud saws. They didn't have diamond blades and that sort of stuff in those days, so basically you used a metal blade and you coated it with abrasive like valve grinding compound, and you just kept adding it, and it would slowly cut through. Might take most of the day to cut through a rock. But what a great hobby after WW2. Send the kids out to collect rocks, you know. There's a cheap hobby. makes them makes them strong and but anyway, I cut a lot of rocks with him. He was early into the lapidary thing. And Northern California was a great place for it. There was a lot of different types of stone up there, including gold and gold quartz and stuff. But anyway, I made jewelry when I got back from the service, uh, and through most of my law enforcement years, I was still making jewelry. It was a good hobby, and then I got into the knife making. I think I was 26, 27 years old, something like that. Got into knife making. I'm still doing it 50 years later, so.
Yeah.
I guess I enjoy it. But that was one of the other great things about the San Jose Gun Show in the 60s. That show was attended by many collectors of the California stuff, and that's really how I got interested in the California style knives and gold quartz stone and the materials and techniques they use for making the knives. Hugh Hayes got to be a great friend of mine, and he was one of the early pioneer collectors of the California knives, and the canes and the jewelry. And there's a great book, California Best, that probably has got a variety of the things made in California, in gambling and saddles and you name it. Everything that was made in California and collected, and including a lot of advertising. But also, there's a great section in there on California knives and the styles. And that was Brad Witherall, and Brad was around in those early days too. Greg Martin, Chris Degini. Anyway, there was most of the early California collectors attended the San Jose show, the Cow Palace show, and all that back in the 60s, and that was kind of my introduction into the California knife styles and stuff. Hugh Hayes, like I said, got to be a friend, and he and his wife Marianne, they invited me to their home in Stockton, and I went out there a couple of times from San Jose and had lunch with them. And anyway, got to play with the collection and the knives and everything. And he said, you should make some of those. And I said, yeah, that looked like it'd be a good challenge, on stuff. And he said, well, take some with you. And I go, no, let me take some pictures and some measurements, because they were valuable in those days too. Now some of them bring over $100,000, for one knife. But back in those days, there were still $1,000 to $3,000 for a San Francisco knife, and that was a lot of money in 1969 or 70. So,
yeah. I want to go back to the California's Best book. I was doing a little bit looking up. So is it the California's Best Old West Art and Antiques book?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a
Brian and Brad Witherell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, were they brothers?
No, father and son.
Father and son. Okay. Yeah, I'll have.
Yeah, and Brad's a good friend. He's still involved somewhat. His son runs the business. It's in Sacramento now.
Yeah, that's pretty.
And they were instrumental too, and part of the uh, Grass Valley show, which is originally kind of it's been going on, I think, since 90s or so, up in Grass Valley every year in the summer. And typically the dealers up there handle San Francisco or California items, uh, mining equipment, all that sort of stuff. And all that was really interesting to me because, like I said, the grandparents on both and great grandparents on both sides were involved in mining in Northern California during the gold rush. So,
Yeah. Well, something that's interesting, I think, is my wife was doing genealogy because she, they have an oral tradition of sharing family connections and whatnot, but she didn't realize in doing her genealogy that she's like a seventh generation Texan, right? And
okay, yeah, sure.
yeah, and something about that because I'm kind of a mutt, like I grew up in the Appalachians in Pennsylvania, and I until I started doing a little genealogy, the most that my family would go back like certain people is maybe three generations, something like that. But what I recognize about Californians like you is there's a lot of similarities in California pride and Texas pride, and in the rich history of those states and the things that naturally came out of both type of societies and cultures, as it were. So I mean, I can definitely see where when you have the very rich history of prospecting and pioneering out in California, and you'd been exposed to it for so long, it seems like a natural progression to use the materials and to pick up some of that art and things of the time, and to do your own thing with it. Combine all of these, your own history in your craft and knives.
Yeah, like I said, the grandfathers and great grandfathers. There's a couple mines up Northern California that are historical landmarks, a couple of the family homes and stuff. So I was born and raised around all of that, in Weaverville and the Trinity River area and Junction City and Redding. So good part of my family history. So
Well, yeah, and something that even today is not used an exceptional amount inside of the knife craft is gold in quartz matrix, and I'm interested to know, is there a specific reason other than like the relative rarity of the stone matrix and everything that keeps makers from using it, or is it just like an aesthetic thing that you don't see a lot of that anymore?
well, gold quartz in itself is um, a very fairly rare collectible stone if the gold is visible in it. Okay, so when I say visible, a working mine that was crushing a ton of rock and getting 1 ounce of gold was profitable. Okay, uh, the mines like the original 16. Okay, they had pocket areas where there was 16 ounces of gold to a ton of rock, which was a tremendous amount of gold and very visible. Um, Aesthetically, they used that in California jewelry because it was part of the. I'm from California and uh, I'm involved in gold mining. Uh, they sent home back east or to foreign countries where they came from. They sent jewelry and things made in California with the gold quartz stone. And the gold quartz ran from basically white to black stone with whenever stones were found in the mines that had good visible gold to them, they were high graded. And this high grade material, a lot of it went to jewelers and watchmakers and stuff. So that's kind of where it came from and was very, very collectible. Okay. But nowadays, very good gold quartz, uh, like from the original 16 mine that's still operating up in the Allegheny, uh, that material runs about twice the price, spot price of gold. Well, the spot price of gold yesterday was around $2,400. Okay, so you're talking about a rock that costs $4,800 an ounce. Um, so very few knife makers use that. Number one, there's not very little of it around that you can locate. Most of the One of the best sources I ever had was a gal, and she wrote a book on hydraulic mining in Northern California and stuff. And anyway, she passed away. It's been 3 years ago now, I guess. And she had made contact with all these miners in Grass Valley, Auburn, Nevada City, and Latrobe, and other little mining towns in Northern California. And she was able to get some stone on occasion. I bought a lot of it from her. And so did Phil Lowbred to give to Buster to work on some knives. Um, Steve Rapp got some of the material from through that source also. But anyways, after she passed away, it's been very difficult to find much in the way of that material. Uh, and it was actually never used in knives. There were some knives, a few folders, small folders, that used. Um, Actually, the knives came from England and the Wostenholm folders, and they came as skeleton frame knives to California, and they were had gold panels put on the side with inlays of gold quartz and other stones. But that was the only. I think Hugh Hayes had two Will and Fink knives, larger ones, folding knives also that had some gold quartz in them. But other than that, there were no full size San Francisco dress knives with gold quartz. Uh, Typically, they used the materials that were available in California, which was walrus ivory, elkhorn, and abalone shell. Abalone in those days, there were some big shells. I still got a couple around here that are 10, 12 inches in diameter. So there was large abalone in those days, and you could get some flat areas out of them.
Yeah.
But anyway, I was fascinated with the jewelry because I made jewelry and I saw the gold quartz in jewelry, and I said, "Wow, that'd be really nice." So uh, I made a lot of jewelry with gold quartz, and I started putting it into some San Francisco knives. Uh, Probably I'm thinking the credit for that goes to Jim Hardenbrook. I think about 1973 or 4 or 5, somewhere in that area, uh, at the Las Vegas Antique Arms Show. They had a section for knife makers. Actually, we got the room they used to store tables and chairs in, and at the back of the stairs. So after the entire show was set up in the big room, we got the little room where they stored all that crap, and that got to be the knife maker's room. but you know what? Those were some amazing shows. I mean, you talk about there was Lovelace and Horn and Henry and Gil Hibben and you name it. Everybody that was in life, just Steve Johnson, Jim Hardenbrook, uh, Ted Dowell, and Dwight Towell, and God, I could go on forever. You know, uh, anyway, there's some early, really good knife makers at that show. I was there. Not saying no, I was a young guy in those days, and not the best knife maker by any means. Not one of the best knife makers by any means in those days. But Jim Hardenbrook made a push dagger, and he used gold quartz for the handle, and the gold quartz was from Colorado, a little different than the California material, dark color, blackish brown, with like grains of sand that were gold in it. There's little tiny flakes, pieces inside the stone. A different type of stone. But anyway, the handle fascinated myself and Buster, and we talked to Jim about it and everything, and that kind of led to the idea of why not the gold quartz in the knives, full size knives. And of course, the full size knives were based off the California dress knives that had silver sheaths and hair scabbards and engraving and fairly fine looking embellished work. And they cost about $100 back in the original days. So, that was expensive even during the gold rush days. That was a lot of money. But people bought them as gifts to send back home, see how successful I am as a gold miner in California. Everybody wanted to relate to the gold rush, and San Francisco was kind of like the Paris of the U.S. It was a very wealthy city, and the very successful businessmen. Not too many of them were miners. Most of them were the guys that supplied hardware and equipment to miners, and they dressed up fairly fine every day. And they might have a gold quartz pocket watch chain with a face on the cover of the watch being in gold quartz, maybe a gold quartz cane, gold head, and maybe a silver knife with abalone or ivory or walrus ivory or elkhorn handles, and maybe some engraving on the handle of the knife. So it was an elegant thing. So, and kind of showed them that you were part of the history of mining in California, and important and wealthy because of the mining.
Yeah, that makes sense. And something that I look at, well, I think about the if anybody understood the economics of mining, and you knew that, like, to crush stone, maybe you could get an ounce, like in a really good claim, you could get an ounce out of a ton. For you to kind of flippantly have like these pieces of quartz matrix and whatnot, it was to show that it was so abundant. And then, as a result, quartz matrix was a status symbol because of the rarity and also the claims producing that type of gold at the time.
Well, everybody kind of thinks that the big gold rush and the money in California came from the gold nuggets in the river and stream, and that was pretty much exhausted after a year or two as the gold rush started. They found gold in the streams, but some of the miners said, "Hey, what's this white stone or brown stone or whatever color it might be? What's that embedded with the gold?" And anyway, that's how gold quartz was basically discovered. They wanted to find the source for where those gold nuggets came from, and find the source for how that gold uh, grew. And the Sierra Nevada mountains, where the Pacific and the continental plates came together, uh, where those rocks slammed together, and there was a lot of fractures, and in the fractures, quartz formed. And quartz is very abundant; it's all over the world. But in that quartz, in certain areas, if the chemical composition and the heat and the fumes and the whatever, whatever the magic potion was, gold would form in the fractures of the quartz. And some areas, there was some in California, some in British Columbia, northern Washington, and on up to Greenland and stuff, and in Australia, where there were big gold discoveries, and then Alaska. But but basically, in California, it was the gold forming into fractures of the quartz rock that was formed into fractures of the slate or granite. So anyway, like I said, it's a rare material, and good visible gold was difficult to find. Uh, there's still a lot of it that can be found. The mines never quit producing gold. The area I live in, our main town is Jackson, and between McComey Hill, Jackson, Sutter Creek, Amador City, and Plymouth, some of the richest mines in the world. And they never quit producing gold. The government shut them down during World War II. And once you shut a mine down, it fills with water. And then the water gets polluted from the asbestos and the rock and the mercury and on down the line. So by the time the country kind of recovered from, or was recovering from World War II, they got into some hydraulic mining and stuff, but environmentally it destroyed large areas of land, leaving nothing but bare rock. So when the environmental thing got really impacted into all of that, the mines were not, it wasn't worth the amount of money it would cost to try to reopen a mine. And that's what the problem is today. There's still plenty of gold in the ground, but the environmental impact and the permit process and the safety aspects of reopening the mines are much too expensive to really be involved in.
Yeah.
It gets more involved, when the price of gold is like where it's at right now. Uh, it gets more interesting and more possible to do it, but I don't know if it'll sustain the price it's at now. It gets it gets complicated. The gold, there's got to be jewelers and jewelry shops like Macy's and Emporium and Costco and on down the line. They can't sell gold uh, jewelry at a reasonable cost that the public can buy uh, when the prices get too high for the source.
Yeah. Well, that was one problem at the time. So, in the last recession, that's when I was doing my apprenticeship and everything, and we could reasonably do silversmithing and make jewelry that way, but most of the gold and platinum jobs were all custom jobs that people came in, they had the money, they wanted to custom order something, and then we could make it that way because you could pay for the raw materials out of usually a deposit or whatever. But
Right.
it got so bad that if you wanted to make any new pieces, I don't know, there was just like some really great stuff that was coming out of the shop because the guy I worked for was custom jeweler for 30 plus years before the recession hit. but like large amethyst stones, like beautiful turquoise and things like that, all of these exhibition style pieces, we put them out there, but people couldn't pay what the gold price at the time,
Right.
and we couldn't make any
It's
more.
restrictive.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, for sure.
I
And
think we're starting to see that a little bit with silver too, because it's the same deal. It's gotten to be, I think it's $28 an ounce or something. When I was making a lot of silver jewelry, it was between a buck and went up to $3 and something an ounce. So
yeah, well, yeah,
nowadays it would be hard for a startup, a startup maker or whatever.
well, yeah, and that at the time, I can't remember what silver was at the time, a little over $100 or so, maybe an ounce. But the downstream effect is that you take something that is between 75 or $100 an ounce, and then you want to make sterling silver wire or sheets or things like that for you to turn into other things. It's like that becomes more expensive because then you pile on the manufacturing for those goods. Yeah,
Fabrication.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
so it just became prohibitive. Like you could make like a silver wedding bands or things like that for relatively inexpensive, but when the sheet price of silver went up, and there's also a connotation with silver where in inside of like the Arizona or New Mexico style, like the turquoise and more of that, I don't know if you call it Native American style, but definitely the Southwest style of jewelry making. There was a context where silver did really well, but if you tried to swap out the same aesthetic that you'd have in jewelry for silver, people just wouldn't pay for it because they're like, well, it's silver. I remember when that was only a few dollars an ounce.
Right,
Whereas
exactly.
gold has always had an intrinsic value and attraction. So it's kind of interesting, how these things,
You say that is funny, but gold was 30 something dollars an ounce for uh I got up until the 60s, I guess.
well, yeah. I mean, you got to think like I was
It
born.
was government controlled, but
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, for somebody who's born in the late '80s, the prices of gold and whatnot were uh, untouchable for somebody like me when I started collecting bullion and everything. I started
Right.
early on. My exposure to silver and whatnot actually came from a little bit of my dad, who collected coins, but also we had a good family friend that was a very avid coin collector. I think that the only American minted coins that he didn't have was like a few of the very rare V nickels and things like that. So his collection, basically from the time of minting and before, was complete, except for a few very rare ones. And so, understanding bullion prices and things like that was something that I got into very early on. And I was collecting silver ingots for a while, which if I had an extra $15 that I got for for lunch money or something, if I was like, cause I was there was a jewelry and bullion shop that also did coins inside of a town where I played. I was playing for the local symphony orchestra when I was a young teenager, and so I would take the opportunity between practice sessions to walk down about a mile to the coin shop, and I would just take my money and I would put it into coins and bullion. It was very obtainable, but gold was just like something I couldn't do at the time. I think maybe it was $170, $180 an ounce, something like that. But quite a bit different than in the '60s for sure.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Uh, that's one of the things. See, like the San Francisco knives that I do now, people don't realize that there's between $10,000 and $20,000 in the materials. So it gets very expensive to build a piece like that.
Oh
You
yeah,
know, 4 or 5 ounces of gold is, it gets there pretty fast. So,
yeah. Well, I can see how that is.
and the gold quartz,
Yeah,
like I said, is very expensive for good quality material.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can see how that holistically would be cost prohibitive to anybody who wants to try to get into it. Because I mean, you got to think, some of your prices, for like a Michael Price style dagger might be, 30 to 45,000 dollars. But like a large portion of that is actually going into the raw materials to make everything.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, it's like I said, there can be, uh, yeah, like if you used some of the early pieces I did, got they were pretty reasonable, but gold was very inexpensive during the day. So, a knife that was 10 or $15,000 maybe had $7,000 worth of material in it. Now that same piece might have $20,000 worth of material in it, so or 15,000. So
Yeah, not to mention that style of knife with those materials and that price, there's fewer and fewer collectors that are willing to spend that kind of money on a knife. I mean, it's definitely like museum quality and museum materials, but it seems like the kind of collectors are shifting from that older style of like guns and antiques and knives and things that were made by the old guard of makers, and shifting that to other things. I mean, I don't know, cars and houses
I
and
think
things
a
like
lot of
that.
that. I think a lot of that's exposure. Uh, once they see the quality and uh, the workmanship in a piece. Um, I mean, there's still collectors, obviously. I'm still in business. I've been doing this for 50 years, and I'm still making and selling some San Francisco knives and gold quartz and stuff. But a lot of makers, I think they've kind of lost that concept of these collectors that we have, that I had, that Buster had, that uh, Loveless had, on down the line. Okay. Uh, these collectors invested as much in the maker as they did in the product, just like any other kind of art form, paintings or jewelry or uh, bronzes or whatever. Uh, the collector maker interface uh, is extremely important. Not so much to the maker, because I don't think they understand that. But many of the collectors that I have or have had through the years that have passed away always said to me, "I wish I knew how to do that. I don't, but I know somebody that does. You were able to do that, or come up with that idea for me." I made a miniature gold ore car for a collector friend, George Cross. He passed away, but uh, he wanted something exceptional out of the way. But this isn't the kind of thing that you can sell, or sell the concept or the design or anything online. You know, that's for semi-manufactured stuff, or lower end stuff. But if you want a true piece of art, you need to talk to the artist, and that's what most of the collectors want to have, that one-on-one relationship with who makes the product for them. That's why I got involved with the Solvang Knife Show again, and became one of the promoters of the show. Is that show was one of those where many collectors came to, and they came to the show for one reason, that was to talk directly with the artist and get to know the artist and see his work, and maybe come up with a project to do. Okay. COVID changed the knife scene tremendously. A lot of people found, well, I can sell my hunting knife or my fighting knife or my tactical or my so-called everyday carry knife online. I don't need to go to a show. But for the true art knife maker and art knife collector, you do need that show, and you do need the interchange between the collector and the maker to come up with projects. That gold ore project that I did, ore car that I did, that caused people came from all over to the Las Vegas show to see that project that I did for him. And that was an idea that him and I had by sitting at a show and talking for a couple hours. And that's, I think, where we're losing some of the growth in the knife making is we don't have enough interchange between makers and collectors, and we need more of it. The Guild Show used to be a great example of that back in the day. Las Vegas has always been. There's a lot of money in the antique arms show in Las Vegas. There's millions of dollars that change hands every show between collectors of antique guns and engravers and makers and things. And these people are collectors. And my experience with collectors are they might collect oil paintings, they might collect bronzes, they might collect pottery, they might collect this or that, but they hadn't been exposed to knives. And once they were exposed to knives, they became a knife collector also. And you can't do that online. It looks like going shopping on Amazon as compared to sitting down and talking with the artist that's doing your work.
Well, yeah. And I have a lot of mixed feelings on knife shows, like the current scene in knife shows, because I'm a big fan of like Blade Show because of what it does for the knife making community at large, but I also dislike it in some ways as a custom knife maker because it always feels like the competition, as it were, is kind of the wrong word, but it seems like it's always a fight for dollars, and it's not evenly balanced between the different discipline in knives. There's the custom knife makers are kind of fighting for the pool of money that sits with the buyers for customs, and then you have the same people that are coming in for production knives or things like tactical knives or things like that. And it seems like if you want to swim in that pool, you have to do the same thing that everybody else does. And I feel in some ways that a maker's individuality and artistic ability kind of gets lost in that pool of just, everybody trying to fight for the same dollars that are, really kind of tribal at this point. Everybody is kind of grouped into the same room, but there's so many different profiles of customers and collectors and whatnot.
Yeah, I think that's true. Anytime you have a show that involves factory, foreign factory, machine made, handmade, supplies, and on down the line. I think there's too much going on. They're good shows to go to, good fun shows to go to, and you can find maybe some supplies that you hadn't found. But for the handmade knife, it's pretty difficult to find a show that's concentrated on handmade knives anymore. Again, that was the concept for bringing Solvang Knife Show back together. And I'm not pushing advertising on Solvang. I'm just saying that the Knife Makers Guild originally when we had our own show. Uh, Tremendous growth in the Kansas City days. You know, we had, I want to say, somewhere between 300 and 350 custom knife makers at that show. Uh, near the end run at Kansas City, which came in 85. 86, we moved to Dallas. But people came to that show from all over the world because they wanted to meet the maker and see the work that they were doing. And there really wasn't, and I'm not knocking progress either. The world, there's a lot of CNC makers now, designers on down the line, but most of them are competing for the same dollar too. They're trying to come up with a design for a factory to make. And they might be competing with 50 other or 25 other designers that are submitting designs to that factory at the same time. One of my very good friends, Ken Onion, been in the business for way back, many years. Okay. When I say many years for the designers being involved with factories. Okay. He was one of the originals that designed stuff, and his stuff went into production originally with Kershaw with his speed safe operating mechanism. So probably the first guy that was really successful in bringing custom work into the factory knife. But nowadays I don't know how many designers there are, and I think CRKT has 25 or 30 designers making designs for them, and they're coming out in limited quantity and stuff. And I don't know where, you're chasing the tail of the dragon. I don't know how far that goes until it's pretty soon the designer's just working for the knife company and not out there actually trying to make a knife on his own.
Yeah.
But like I said, it's very hard to find a show now where it's all craftsmen. So, hopefully Solvang reintroduces that. Maybe the guild gets involved, and they're big enough now again to have a show of their own. They could combining a show with the bladesmiths made sense. That was the biggest mistake the guild ever made. And I think the knife makers too. It was the biggest mistake. There was an ego problem, and the bladesmiths separated from the fabrication makers. It was sad because we had a great group of people together, and it could be again. People have to learn what works and what doesn't work, and the guild suffered. I think ABS suffered for many years too, the same deal. And we lost that attendance from as many collectors as we did have in those days. We had a lot of people fly in for those shows. And it's so slowly faded out. And again, most of it was just decisions that weren't the greatest at the time.
Yeah. Well, so what you're speaking of is there was a time where the ABS and the guild combined efforts to have a show. Was it in Kansas City? I can't remember where it was originally located.
It was a Knife Makers Guild.
Mhm.
Originally started with 20 something makers in Las Vegas, went to Houston for a couple of shows, then to combined with a gun show in Overland, Kansas for a couple of years, and then moved to the Crown Center. And the Knife Makers Guild show at the Crown Center, that was the biggest growth, I think, in the guild's history. And when I say the guild, that included both fabricators and bladesmiths. So uh,
Yeah, and that
just about equally represented, and it was a great combination for collectors too.
Yeah, and then after that, they kind of I can't remember. I don't think the ABS actually had any show, right? Like that show moved down to Dallas and was just the ICCE show eventually, and then Blade Show bought the rights um, to that, and that's turned into Blade Show Texas, if I remember my lineage correctly.
Yeah, but all blade shows, I mean, and it makes sense for them financially. Obviously, uh, Blade Magazine and the Blade shows represent the entire industry, handmade, factory, uh, suppliers, promoters, on down the line. So you have to have all of those people at the show. But for collectors of custom knives, um, it's hard for them to go to a blade show and wade through everything else that's there. I mean, there's foreign manufacturers, American manufacturers, suppliers from all over, uh, uh, CNC makers, designers, and some custom knife makers. You
Yeah,
know, yeah.
well, yeah,
Uh, and the number gets smaller, I think, every time I see it. But, and again, Blade Magazine, they represent all of those elements of the knife world. Okay, so uh, their concept was true back in the day. Okay, with the Knife Makers Guild, that concept was true. If you put some wonderful craftsmen only in a building and you invite people to come to it, pretty soon that develops into a great art exhibit. Call it what you want, okay? But it's craftsmen and collectors you're meeting, okay? And not involved in side stuff like flashlights and pendants and whirligigs and you name it on down the line and manufactured stuff. Okay, so you get back to the artist collector concept. That's where the guild needs to go. Okay, whether they will or not, I don't know. I'd like to see that, but only I'd like to see that because that gives the young guy the opportunity to enjoy the same life that I've had. Okay. Uh, being a knife maker, you're never going to be rich. Okay. Give us $1 million. We keep making knives until it was gone, kind of deal. But, but I've enjoyed everything that I've done and I've spent 50 years doing it. The opportunity for young people to be able to do that again will basically fall to um, if we can get the collector and the artist back together.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that I think about a lot, as especially as a member of the Knife Makers Guild that is really focused on, um, I don't know, supporting the guild with modern technology and things, but with a respect for the past, like what you guys had propagated and invested in. And like I think that one thing that looms over the Knife Makers Guild is um, this specter of the drama and everything. When I was getting into knife making, most of the old guild members that had since bounced from it were like, you don't need the guild. There's the internet, right? And then you go like me as a knife maker. I was like, okay, well, I know the internet pretty well. Let me go ahead and sell on there. And then I find that there's a disconnect, and the avenues to sell online are becoming more stringent because a lot of social media platforms and things are limiting the kind of wares that you can actually sell online or get exposure to. Like there's some banks that will shut you down if they know that you're selling knives at all, not even in association with guns. And then you what I found is that the guild exists in a space where they're trying to figure out where they belong in a world where everybody is looking for that sub $1,000 knife that really does. It's a hard value proposition for a knife maker to put a lot of themselves in something that they know when they go to a show or whatever very well might not sell, and so then they have to transition to making what the market wants, and then they change from becoming a knife artist to a a handmade knife manufacturer, and they're competing in a pool of machine manufacturers that can do it cheaper, which has a larger value proposition with the people that are collecting. And I use air quotes in collecting because for me, if you can have like more than one of a certain type of knife or whatever, if it's obtainium all the time, then the collectability of something kind of loses a little bit of its luster, and people are just looking to bolster a collection of these kind of knives or whatever, that if you talk to the guy who's making them, you could probably get them in a few months from being on a waiting list or whatever. Like, to me, I don't really know where we go from here to try to rebuild the handmade or custom knife market in an era when everybody wants easy wins and a quick climb to the top. It's like, I don't want to necessarily make knives in an IKEA crowd where everybody makes stuff for super cheap, and then they have it for a little while, and then all they really care about is being able to sell that right away if they want to and make a little bit of money on the aftermarket. It's like, where do you actually sit as an artist when nobody really cares about the artistry that goes into something, or the blood, sweat, and tears of the maker itself? And that's kind of where I sit in a very confused spot as to, like, what, how do you change that and make it where it is a one-on-one connection with the people who are buying from you or investing in you as a maker.
Well, that's where the interchange with the collector and the maker come together. And that's the kind of show that you need. Okay. A collector can look online, and this knife is $49 and this knife is $4,000. And that collector doesn't really know the difference. And the only way he's going to know the difference is talking to the maker or artist and having him explain to it why this particular knife and what went into making it, uh, what it takes, what the materials are, how he learned the craft, his history. These guys are collectors, and thank God I've had many, okay, over the years. Uh, they're developed, and they're developed because, like I said, most of them will come right out and tell you, if I had that skill, I would be so happy, but I don't have that. My skill is in banking or building construction or whatever. Okay, my I don't have the talent to see something in a rock or in a piece of metal or whatever. Okay, but I see it in you. And now you've told me that, I make this by hand. There's no machine involved in this part of it or that part of it or whatever. Or there are machines involved in it, and I'm turning this little dial to make this cutter go this way and turning it back this way. Okay, that's still done by hand. Or if I'm designing it on a screen and pushing a button and the machine's doing the cutting, yeah, is there a cost difference? Yes, there's a lot cost difference because I'm spending many hours doing it where the machine may be able to spit out two or three every 10 minutes. But without that interchange, and the only way you get that interchange is at a show where the knife maker and the collector can talk.
Yeah. Well, I guess my question to that, right, is do you think there's enough of a market that actually cares anymore? And what I mean is, I look at the difference between antique style furniture, right? When you have a hardwood piece of furniture that you look in the drawers and everything is dovetailed, everything is perfect in all of its parts, and you think about the craftsmanship that went into making that thing, you can easily see where doing everything by hand is worth maybe the $1,400 or $3,000 or something, depending on what kind of furniture it is. You apply French polish and claw feet and all sorts of things from different. You look at different eras of antique furniture, and you're like, well, if this has lasted 100 years, definitely there's a value in craftsmanship. But it seems at least that as a culture, we don't really think about that as much collectively, and we think more about, well, this I for the price of that antique furniture, I can buy and throw away 100 pieces of IKEA furniture, right? Rather than having one that lasts forever, they think about, well, I could just replace it when it gets dingy, right? I don't have to worry about dinging out, just throw it away, buy another one. Do you think that there's a place in modern zeitgeist of ephemeral, throwaway utilitarian furniture and things like that for a custom knife maker and that investment exchange to happen as a collector to exist?
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, like I said, you need the interchange between the collector and the maker. Uh, and I don't know how you get that without actually having shows where, just like any other art form, okay, uh, or any other collectible item. Uh, all you have to do is pick up some auction catalogs, and you can see uh, that there are still many collectors in the world. It got easier. I can go online and I can look at the catalog if I want to buy, let's say, Colt firearms or antique black powder pistols or rifles or, you know, a variety of things, spurs and on down the line. Uh, but are there still collectors? Yes. Are there still collector shows? Mm, they're getting limited. Okay. There's not too many around. And maybe if we want to grow the collectability, then we have to provide that same opportunity to the collector that we had back in the day. Kansas City and the Guild Show was unique, okay, but there were several factors that made it unique, okay. Number one, it was located in the central part of the country. Number two, it was a hub city. It was an airport that was easy to get in and out of from the East Coast to the West Coast or around the world. Okay. Uh, if when the guild moved to Orlando, it was probably the beginning of the slide down the hill. Okay. I had nothing against Orlando other than it's not an easy place to get to from the West Coast or the central area. Okay, you got to go through somewhere to get to Orlando. It was good for people who lived on the East Coast. It was a simple shot. But we started losing the collectors and the makers from the West. Okay. And the same was true if we would have had the guild show in San Francisco or in Las Vegas or in Long Beach, California. Okay. We would lose that East Coast faction. So you still need to go back to the central part of the country, someplace that's uh, convenient for a collector. And you got to remember, most of these collectors are workers. Okay. These guys put in long hours, long days, uh, and their whole goal is to make that money so they can collect what they want to collect. Okay, but you got to make it easy for them to get to the collection. Okay, and that's why auction houses are pretty successful. But if they had the opportunity, a lot of the collectors used to come from the East Coast to the West Coast for one day to Kansas City, and it was a 3 day show. Okay, but they came, they bought what they wanted to buy on the first day, they got back to work on the next day. It was easy to do. When the show moved to Orlando, if you were a West Coast collector and a hard worker, okay, you got on an airplane, you tied up 12 to 14 hours to get to Orlando. A fast flight would be 8 hours, okay, because you had to stop in Dallas or Salt Lake City or Denver or Chicago or Atlanta or some other place to get there, okay. So that tied up one day of mine. So I had to go the day before. Now I lost a day of work. So, like I said, you got to make it convenient for the collector and the maker.
Yeah. No, I know all that makes sense.
But are there still collectors out there? Yes, there's still collectors out there. I found, I think, two or three collectors in the last couple of years at the Las Vegas show. That's another thing that makers don't do is they don't stick with the show. If they go to a show and they don't sell a knife, they go, "Well, I don't want to do that anymore." Okay. Uh, but people have to see you and recognize you. Okay, I've been going to the the Las Vegas Antique Arms Show since the early '70s, and I've missed two shows. I think once or twice. Okay, when my late wife got sick and passed away. Once when I lost a family member or had a medical problem of my own. But otherwise, I always made that show, and I still make that show every year. And I still get collectors out of that show. Okay. And it's the same with people that go to Wanamaker's show in Tulsa. Okay. It comes at a bad time for me. I don't really have time to do that, right? But I'm going to start one of these days. I'm going to go do that show. But you got to go to a show and you got to be there. People got to see what you do, okay, and talk to you about it. Pick up one of your knives and play with it or whatever. And yeah, you may not sell any knives that particular year, but that guy will probably come back, or that gal will probably come back a year or two later and say, "Hey, I want to get one of those," And okay, so, and pretty soon they become a regular customer. And that's the only way you're going to make it in this business. Uh, if you want to make manufactured stuff, then you're going to compete with a lot of people. And you can be on the internet all you want. And you can sell your stuff on the internet. When you start making, it's hard to sell an art piece on the internet, in my experience anyway. And when I say art piece, if you want to sell a knife that's $30,000 or $40,000 or $20,000 or $10,000. People want to pick it up and handle it. They want to look at it and feel in their mind that it's really worthwhile. And you can have people sit there with a pair of blue gloves on and flip a knife 47 directions in 10 seconds and a video ad, and it's not going to have that effect on a collector of actually handling it, talking to the maker.
Well, yeah. I mean, and there's lots of different people that we, as a podcast show and everything, get to interact with, and you have everybody down from the the hand forged or stock removal knives that are sub $300 all the way up into your range of 20, 30, $40,000. And I do agree that there has to be a certain respect for the collector, that when they're spending their hard-earned money, and it doesn't matter whether it's $300 or $30,000, that you have a due diligence in remembering that they work hard for their money, and you have to work hard to prove that that money is something that should be invested with you. I think one of the reasons why I've moved, kind of moved around with my show schedule and everything, has to do more with the fact that I'm really searching for an area of knife making and of where I can exhibit my work, that there is a value there, versus trying to cast a wide net and do things that are marketable to a crowd just to get that instantaneous reward of sales. I really do value, the collector and the user, and their desire to spend their money with me. And so I want to be able to nurture that show activity, and being regular in a show circuit, where I think that that's being nurtured and cultivated. Sometimes I feel like I'm just a very, very small fish in a large pond at large knife shows. And then other ones I go to, small knife shows, and maybe my knives are priced, several $100s above other makers. And it's not something that the general show goer can purchase. Right. But for me, I think it's, as a maker, it's about finding that avenue that best represents the kind of work that I do and the customer relationship that I want to have. And so I'm not as focused on like the instantaneous sale as I am the relationship that I can build with people that go to those shows. So that's kind of where I'm at, is figuring out where that makes sense based on what I make.
Yeah, again, like I said, I think a lot of makers, they go to a show and they don't sell something, and they decide they're not going to come back to that show, where they see some other knife maker selling some things. Well, if that knife maker can sell his work, you can sell your work, okay? But you have to actually talk to people. I think, I mean, I look at it in my mind, okay? I made knives for $65 and $75 and $85, okay? Mel Ferris and Nate Posner at the San Francisco Gun Exchange, and Nordic Knives in the early 70s. They kind of started me in the knife business, okay? I made tons of knives for San Francisco Gun Exchange. I'd go up there every couple of months and deliver some little bird and trout knives that I made, that I sewed a leather sheath for and everything else, and they were $72 or $76 or what. They went up slightly every now and then. But I paid my dues, okay? A lot of people don't want to pay any dues and would like their knives to be instantly $1,000. And that may work for some people, okay? But in reality, almost any craft or work that you get into, you need to pay your dues, and you need to learn the the skills required to sell your product and to make your product. I mean, I'm very fortunate. I'm all around artist. I mean, I do engraving and carving and um, have experience with jewelry and bronzes and on down the line. Uh, and that sells a lot of my work. Okay, just the people come by and they look and they go, wow, I really like this part of it or that part of it, or tell me a little bit more about this. Okay. Well, you can sell your product the same way. I mean, I sold hundreds of those bird and trout knives, and I sold hundreds of a combat knife I made in the 80s, a Vietnam commemorative thing. So, uh, but you have to be at a show and you have to be out there in the public and they have to get to know you. You know, you can,
Yeah.
the internet, I don't know. Okay. It's not really my experience. Okay. I see lots of stuff on there, how successful it is. I haven't got a clue. I know there's some of the, um, knife designers that they come up with a new knife or a new design or something, which is getting difficult. I mean, technically, start thinking about a folding knife and how many variations you can make of that knife and the handle shape and the blade shape. And after a while, number one, it's been done before. Um, and number two, how many uh, changes can you make to that handle to where it's no longer comfortable or no longer functional? Uh, it's pretty limited. If you look at the current stock of what's the favorite terminology now? EDC, okay, everyday carry. Well, some guy's version of everyday carry may be something that wouldn't even fit in your pocket, or the next one has got six finger grooves and you only got five. How are you going to handle that? Okay. I'm, there's only so much you can do with all that design stuff. Okay. And there's some very successful people doing that. But, for the average knife maker, um, pay your dues, do your work, improve the quality. Okay. Uh, Originally, one of the great things about Kansas City, every one of those collectors that came in there, man, they picked up that knife and they looked at the way the grind tapers came together. They looked at the straightness of the blade or the straightness of the double grind on the dagger. They knew what to look for in a knife. And so it was very competitive to become successful. And to grow your business. But the way you did that is you made it fit better, finish better, and the quality of the work stand out to somebody who walks in a knife show. I mean, some of the stuff I see online staggers me that some, I mean, I don't even want to get into that because that's the artist in my head talking about somebody else's work. But, you know, this a straight piece of steel that's got two little clips on it, okay? And it's a straight handle and a straight blade and no guard and no nothing.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, like I'll say it if you don't. I mean, there are a lot of knives that intermingle out there that really have no dimensionality, and one might wonder with those knives like how marketable they really are. But there's this weird paradigm with you know forged in fire and kind of the resurgence of the knife craft, where knife shaped objects and knives that have been made purposefully and with a lot of investment in ergonomics and usefulness and things like that are being compared with lower quality or cruder knives that are knife shaped objects. They have an edge and everything, but they really kind of fall short of the craftsmanship and artistry and self expression that really can be achieved through the medium. And I think that that's one thing that we have a hard time with, is that not everybody who makes knives is focused on knife making as a craft where they improve themselves on. They kind of stay stuck in making crude knives and selling to their market and everything. And I think that there's definitely a place for everybody, but sometimes arguably it makes it really tough, because I don't value knife shaped objects the same way as I do well crafted knives. And it's not it's not a knock on people for making their things, but at some point in time, crude knives they're a commodity knife instead of an investment or heirloom. And if you value that, then you can, there's definitely lots of makers out there who do that. But I'm really interested in trying to push. I'm trying to push the limits on the way that I think about knives, and the capturing something that evokes an emotion versus the emotion just being, well, I can, this is a pretty shank or whatever. I'm really trying to look at the aesthetics of my work and everything, and push that. And I think that there's that falls short sometimes with people, and arguably it's something that we are competing with in a market where knife shaped objects and shanks and things like that are being equally compared in value with collectors, because they really don't know the difference.
Well, I think that's shows in our failure to um, create those shows and make those shows happen. The Knife Makers Guild show was a great example of the market will take care of itself. Okay. If you brought crude work to the guild show, um, typically you went home with it. Um, the knife buyers or collectors themselves policed that market pretty well because they knew what they were looking for, because they had some great examples in there of uh, of work that they read about, saw in magazines, and came to the show and actually handled a knife and actually saw what it does, uh, or what the craftsmanship was. And again, that's hard to do where you've got a um, very mixed media shows. Okay, if you can walk in a show and look at um, a good example would be a Jeff Park. I got one laying here. Okay, Jeff Park Bones type knife. Okay, this is one of my favorite knives in custom knives. Okay, because you talk about a knife that's a really good everyday carry. Uh, Ergonomically, it fits in the hand really well, male or female, big hand, small hand, doesn't seem to matter too much. It opens and closes, and that's everything you want in a knife, okay, in a carry knife. All right, so, and a folder. Okay, so now if you take that same knife and you go to, let's say, Blade Show in Atlanta, you can see it on uh, CRKT's table for $39, right? Or on Jeff Park's table at $1,000 or $1,200, and you don't know the difference. The only difference that you can tell is to actually pick up and feel the knife and look at the workmanship in it, and that's difficult to do because the customer doesn't know the difference between that $39 knife and that $1,000 knife, and the materials and the workmanship and the quality of it. And
Yeah.
that's, like I said, It's the shows that we need to, if we want to have the collectors back in the business and we want the makers to have the opportunity to be a handmade knife maker, uh, quality knife maker. Let's skip the handmade thing because we all use tools one way or another. Okay. And you can't stop progress, you know. If I was 30 years old and starting in or 20 years old and starting in the knife business now, I'd probably have a CNC to do some of my work for me. Okay. I'm old and hard to train, so I don't have. But, uh, but I've enjoyed the life that I've had in the knife making, and I would like young people to have the same opportunity that I had. And the only way we're going to get that is, again, like I said, we have to have some shows that collectors or the general public, okay, because I keep saying collectors, but we make collectors. We made collectors in the Knife Makers Guild. I made collectors at the Antique Arms Show in Las Vegas, the San Jose Gun Show in the early days, or whatever. You make your own collectors uh, who like your piece of work. But the only way you can do that is you got to have a place where you can actually show it and talk with them. And I think if we failed anything in the knife making thing with the guild or ABS or whatever organization, uh, it's having that type of show. We need more of them.
Yeah. Well, I think that makes sense. By the time this airs, Solvang will have been done and over with. End of April, right? Is the show?
Right, next
What?
weekend.
Yeah, and one thing that I really like is the roster of knife makers is top tier. In any knife show, any one of those knife makers would be top tier in it. And so the ability for the people to go to Solvang and to see and feel a large breadth of price points, but a high level of craftsmanship, to me is indicative of the kind of thing that you would experience in the renaissance of the guild shows, right? And that's something that I really look forward to your success in the Solvang show, and that the collectors and knife users start going to that a lot more, because that's something that I think, as we start talking about the resurgence of the custom knife show in the next few years, we're going to be using Solvang as a model for how we can take that same the same essence of the show and replicate that with maybe this Midwestern shows or things like that. Maybe if the guild decides to start doing a show once a year again, all of those, I look to Solvang and what you're doing and what everybody else is propagating out there as a blueprint for how we can continue to invest in this market.
Yeah, it's like I said, I think the guild uh, is big enough. You know, the Kansas City shows, I think we had about 100 makers originally at the show, maybe 115, something like that by then, uh, in the mid 70s. Now I think you told me there's a couple hundred makers in the guild now, 200 and something. I just talked to some, yeah. Uh, so that's plenty to put on a show. I mean, look at Solvang. I think we got room for 50, 55 or 57 makers or whatever, and it's full. And we got people waiting. Uh, but, I picked up a new customer there last year. Um, and any show that you have where somebody that walks in the door is from the public, okay, and sees your work, they can, if they can afford it, okay. But And this one wasn't a real expensive knife. I think it was a couple $1,000 or something, which is a lot of, don't get me wrong, that's still a lot of money for a knife. Okay. Because I use some 39 and $59 ones, for work. Um, but it's still that exposure to the public is where you develop yourself as a knife maker. A lot of times, some of the most successful shows in the world in the early days, and I wish they still had them again, but at one time we had in Las Vegas, we had the Antique Arm Show, the SHOT Show, the Dallas Safari, or the Safari Club, not Dallas Safari. We had the Safari Club uh, and the Knife Show, the Gun Maker Show, and Engravers combined. Uh, and that was all going on within a 7 or 8 day period in Las Vegas. Collectors flew in from all over the world to do those shows because they could go to 5 shows and spend 4 or 5 days or 3 or 4 days in one location and be able to do all that. You talk about successful. I mean, it was not uncommon to sell out everything on your table, and most of your neighbors' tables was gone before the show was over, uh, because it had the collector's interest by combining it with a number of interests. Uh, and everybody started thinking, I'm a show promoter and my idea is the best. Okay, well, that limited the number of shows. Now there's one or two in Las Vegas. Uh, there's one or two in these cities, and they're dividing up that same market that we had all those people concentrated. You could do 2 shows a year in those days, Kansas City and Las Vegas, and that took care of your whole year's revenue and work time. You had to work to make products for those shows each
Yeah.
year.
Yeah, it's a lot of food for thought, for sure. I mean, one thing that I think is, part.
Now, food for thought. I'm going to have to stop pretty quick. I have to finish. I have to finish some engraving
Yeah.
for the Solvang show.
Yeah. Well, no, and I think that we're probably ready to cut it soon. But you're right. One of the plans for you and I, as we've kind of talked through this over the last year, is to do multiple segments where we can talk through a larger breadth of things. So yeah, we covered a little bit about you and your craft, and availability of materials, and how it relates to jewelry, and some history, knife shows and things like that. But there's with over 50 years of making experience alone, not to mention all of the other things that you do, you're probably one of the most converse in a large range of mediums. And so my understanding is after Solvang, you're going to Cambodia for a little while. I want to talk about that on our next episode. But people should expect that we're going to have quite a few more episodes.
Some of that's knife involved.
Yeah.
Yeah. I number one, I made knives with a blacksmith over there and wrote an article for Knife Magazine several years, 2020, I think, was that. Since then, I've met 6 other blacksmiths, knife makers in Cambodia, and I've worked with a couple, and I brought some little miniature hatchets out, or not miniature, small camp hatchets that I had made out of bomb fragments over there from debris we left. But I brought those to Solvang, or to Las Vegas show, and sold them out right away. There was 25 of them, that's all. But anyway, I sold them for like $30 a piece or whatever. But that money I sent directly. There's a couple schools I support over there, so ulterior motives, I guess, or whatever. But it was a way to help pay back a little bit. And
Yeah. Well, I definitely when you come back this summer, I want to talk about that on our next episode, and try to get listeners and other makers involved as they can, and with that that investment that you're making in the areas of Cambodia and around there. But it's an extreme pleasure to even have this time with you. I mean, I know on the back of a show when you have a lot of things to do, it's it's a pleasure. But I also know that your time is very valuable. So
I I put you off several times.
it's okay.
I just I'm getting older, so time is more valuable, and I've had a great run, and I don't want to quit yet.
Yeah. Well, I think the crux of it was every time we sit and talk on the phone about coming and doing a recording, we spend about an hour and a half to 3 hours talking. And so it's like, well, why don't we just get on and start recording?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, hey, Jim, I appreciate your time. I really do. Next episode, let's plan on sometime after you get back from your overseas travels. You have a good show and everything, and stay in touch for sure. But I mean, I really do appreciate the insights that you've given. It is a true honor to be able to talk to somebody with as much experience and longevity in knives as you do. And I can't wait for these further conversations and how we kind of build this this epic of yours out.
Okay, let's do it.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you for spending your time with me on this episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. Remember that you are worthy, loved, and may God strengthen and bless you on your own journey in this crazy thing called life.